Hello everybody, welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Hope you stick around because today I'll be talking about everything I read this October. This was a great reading month for me. I really enjoyed everything I ended up picking up. I read 8 books total for the month. Since it's spooky season, I read entirely horror or Halloween reads, with the exception of one book which was mostly read in the month of September. I'll talk about each in order of my favorite from the months, starting off with my least favorite. First, we start with my least favorite book, which was a bit of a surprise to me. Let me be clear, this book was in no way bad, but I went in expecting to really love this one, from how much I enjoyed prior work from this author. This book was a new short story collection by Mariana Enriquez, translated to English as A Sunny Place for Shady People. Mariana Enriquez previously wrote an incredible horror epic called Our Share of Night, which I read earlier this year and really loved. Enriquez's talent shone through in that intricate genre-bending 600-page epic, which blended horror and historical fiction with incredible skill. So when I saw her new collection of short stories had been translated to English, I was excited to experience the writing in a smaller, more contained format. This collection promised her usual themes of Argentinian history, but focused more on how its legacies impacted contemporary Argentinian life, particularly around issues of gender and class. To express this, it's a collection fascinated with ghosts and the paranormal, but it is difficult to consider a lot of these stories horror. A lot have horror elements, including some pretty striking body horror imagery and some genuinely creepy moments in some of the more memorable stories. But many of them were effective at packing an emotional punch while being incredibly creative and boundary-pushing in the storytelling ability. It is an approach that pushes boundaries creatively, but also doesn't consistently evoke the horror I was hoping for. Several of these stories did really impress me and lived up to the high bar going in. Stories like Face of Disgrace, Nightbirds, and The Refrigerator Cemetery stood out to me. Face of Disgrace had that classic Enriquez blend of horror with social themes, this one exploring gender inequality, all while being one of the more haunting stories in the collection. Nightbirds was an interesting folklore-inspired piece of horror involving women undergoing transformations into birds, and I viewed this story as a creatively told critique of how mental illness in women is often ignored or reduced as mania. And The Refrigerator Cemetery is one of the scariest in the collection. It was unsettling, tragic, brilliantly crafted, and a testament to her ability to weave in the supernatural with social critique. And there were a handful of other stories I enjoyed here, but I think a bunch of these did leave me with a little more to be desired. Maybe it's just me, or maybe these stories are more subtle in their themes, but a few did leave me wanting a bit more. For example, stories such as Metamorphosis, which had quite a great idea with some good commentary on the treatment of women in medicine, but it was lacking to me in its execution. Despite having one of the more lingering images of body horror in this collection, the story as a whole lacked in depth and horror that a lot of the better stories in this collection pulled off better. Overall, while A Sunny Place for Shady People may not have hit the same highs as Our Share of Night, I still really enjoyed it. As can be expected with a short story collection, there was a handful of stories that just didn't connect for me. But there's a lot to admire here, especially in the stories I mentioned. I'd give this collection 3.5 stars. If you're interested in ghostly, thought-provoking stories with a unique cultural lens, you might find some gems you love in this collection. Now I'll dive into Rhythm of War, the 4th book of Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive series. It's the longest book so far, with a lot to unpack, but don't worry, I'll keep this review spoiler-free. One of the things I loved about Rhythm of War is how the stakes felt a lot more real and present compared to the previous book, Oathbringer. It brought back the sense of urgency and intensity that I absolutely loved in The Way of Kings. The characters aren't just going through the motions, they're deeply impacted by the events both in the book and from earlier in the series. You especially feel this in the arcs of Kaladin and Shallan, although I would have liked to spend even more time with them, which is a testament to Sanderson's great character development in the previous books. I've noticed booktubers and Sanderson fans often love talking about the mental health themes when discussing the Stormlight Archive. It is great that people are having these conversations and are finding relatable things in these characters. Perhaps in response to these conversations had or about in these books, I think these themes are even more overtly tackled head on in Rhythm of War. I think this book, more than any of the previous ones, really embraces those conversations around trauma and mental health. Kaladin's journey with PTSD, especially as a soldier, is one of the most well-realized depictions I've seen in fantasy. There are other fantasy authors that have explored this, but Sanderson brings so much depth to the ideas. For those of you who are fans of the wider Cosmere, Rhythm of War does a fantastic job of weaving in more connections, similar to what was done in Dawnshard. It made me so glad that I read Mistborn Era 1 before jumping into this book. Though I'm sure that I am missing other Cosmere references from other standalone books and the Wax and Wayne Mistborn Era 2 books. Sanderson is a master of rewarding his readers with Easter eggs, and if you've read a lot of his books, you'll really appreciate how these connections deepen the story. On a separate note, Adolin's arc in particular really stood out to me this time around. If you caught my August wrap-up, you might remember I wasn't thrilled in how he was underdeveloped in Oathbringer. That definitely changes here. Adolin feels like a much more realized and central character, and I was completely on board with his involvement in this story. Navani also had an amazing storyline. I loved seeing her perspective, especially because her chapters took such a scientific approach to the magic system. They almost gave me hard science fiction vibes, like something you'd see in, for example, Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary. Sanderson put so much thought into the fabrials and how the magic blends with technology. While I admire that level of detail, especially at first, it did start to drag on for me after a while. The magic system was cool, but I felt it slowed down the pacing of the book in parts. And that brings me to one of my critiques, which is the pacing. This is something Sanderson normally nails, but Rhythm of War dragged for me a bit at times. Like I mentioned, the world building and magic technology development, while incredible, did take away from my experience at a point. Though all readers are different and many will really love these sections. Also, I struggled resonating with the flashbacks for Venli and Eshonai. A lot of what was covered felt repetitive of the previous book since we already knew the events from Oathbringer. In my opinion, these sections could have been trimmed down to keep the momentum going. And finally, Sanderson is someone who's praised for his endings, but this ending and its twist just didn't quite hit for me. It kind of came out of nowhere for me. It was just as unexpected and shocking as the ending of the first Mistborn book, but in my opinion, it was not well executed. I'm still excited to see how the narrative change impacts the greater story. Overall, Rhythm of War wasn't my favorite in the Stormlight Archive books. It didn't quite reach the heights of the first 3 books for me, but I still really enjoyed it, and that Sanderson's talent for world building and character development continues to shine. I gave this one 3.5 stars. I'm really looking forward to Wind and Truth being released in December, and already started the chapters that Sanderson's been releasing online. I'm really enjoying it so far. Next up is Out There Screaming, which is another horror short story collection I had high expectations for. This one was an anthology put together by the great Jordan Peele and featuring a variety of incredible Black authors, including Sanana Reeve Dew, Aaron E. Adams, N.K. Jemisin, and P. Jelly Clark. In the intro, Jordan Peele states that the medieval concept of the oubliette, or a dungeon where no one can hear you scream, was his inspiration for the sunken place in his film Get Out. And he says, in this collection, 19 brilliant authors give us their sunken places, their oubliettes. Interestingly, many of the authors that contributed to this collection are not specifically known for writing horror, and many of these authors delivered some of the best stories in the collection. For example, Nnedi Okorafor is, as I understand, known as a science fiction and fantasy writer in the still alive Afrofuturist movement, but contributed the incredible story Darkholme. I could not find examples of her previously writing horror, but she showed mastery in the genre, delivering a eerie story of a woman who is haunted by some entity after breaking cultural traditions at her father's funeral in Nigeria. N.K. Jemisin, who is known for her fantasy series, including the Broken Earth series, delivers the first story in this anthology, which is about a crooked cop, and ends up in a pretty haunting piece of body horror, really flexing her range as a storyteller. In addition to these surprises, we got incredible stories from new talent in the horror spaces, such as P. Jelly Clark and Aaron E. Adams, both of whom I've decided I need to read more of as soon as possible. And horror veteran Tananarive delivers my favorite story from this collection, making me realize I really have to dig deeper into her back catalog. All these stories have a layer of social commentary that you might expect from a compilation made by Jordan Peele. A lot of the authors I mentioned nail this aspect, delivering short stories with depth beyond the surface level stories being told. However, there were a handful of stories in here that, in my opinion, sacrificed good horror storytelling because they were trying too hard to deliver a layered Jordan Peele style story that is meant to inspire some conversation after the fact. But maybe I just struggled to understand some of these stories. I enjoy some level of ambiguity in storytelling, but there were 2 or 3 stories that I just struggled to discern the point with this collection. But as a whole, the great stories in this far outnumbered the lackluster ones, and for that I gave this anthology 3.5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. Alright, next up is The Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury. I don't have a lot to say about this book. I am a huge fan of Ray Bradbury, and despite this being a child or young adult book, I was just drawn to the premise and I found myself picking it up this Halloween morning. This follows a group of boys trick-or-treating and meet a mysterious character named Mr. Moundshroud, who takes the boy on a journey through history to tell each of them the origin of Halloween traditions, while he helps them find their missing friend. I'm not entirely sure how to approach reviewing a book intended for a younger audience, but as a grown-up, I really enjoyed Bradbury's poetic writing style and how he blended fantasy with reality. The journey we went on and the things I learned about Halloween history was fascinating. The ending was cute and tied up the novella nicely. When I started this, I did not realize how childlike the story would be, but in the end, I really enjoyed it. I gave this book 4 stars. It was a perfect light Halloween read. Up next is The Hacienda by Isabella Cañas, a Gothic horror novel set in the aftermath of the Mexican War of Independence. This novel is often compared to Mexican Gothic, which I'll review later in this video, but honestly I think that comparison can be a bit misleading. Yes, The Hacienda and Mexican Gothic are both Gothic-inspired haunted house stories set in historic Mexico. However, they're separated by a century, and each has a unique tone and style. I get why this comparison exists. Mexican Gothic is an incredibly popular novel, and the publishers likely wanted to draw in that readership. But both stories are uniquely original and deserve to stand on their own. And even though I did read both of these back to back, I won't dwell on the comparisons because each is powerful in its own way. In The Hacienda, Beatrice is seeking stability after the Mexican War of Independence devastates her and her family. She marries into what she believes will be a secure future. Her new husband's remote hacienda estate, however, quickly reveals a much darker reality. Disturbing occurrences start to unfold, and she's forced to confront that something sinister may be happening at the haunting hacienda. Desperate for help, Beatrice turns to Padre Andres, a young, handsome priest with a complex past and a mysterious connection to the supernatural. Together they work to uncover the truth lurking in the walls of the house, and their alliance becomes a driving force of the story. The setting of the haunted hacienda is richly described, and the prose flows beautifully, making it easy to picture every detail. This is an incredibly atmospheric story with a strong creep factor. However, it is more unsettling rather than outright terrifying, which makes me think it's a perfect gateway horror for anyone dipping their toes into the genre. Cañas does a great job in balancing the Gothic ambience with accessible scares, keeping you on edge without going overboard. What really stood out to me were the 2 main characters, Beatrice and Padre Andres. Beatrice is ambitious and determined. She doesn't waste time questioning whether something supernatural is going on. She's focused on figuring it out and finding ways to survive. And I found this refreshing because a lot of Gothic heroines often take longer to come around to this realization. Then we have Padre Andres, who is a fantastically well-developed character. He's not just a romantic interest, he plays a pivotal role in the story. Yes, there is clear tension and forbidden romance between him and Beatrice, which adds a layer of depth to the narrative. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the romantic tension, but honestly, it's their kinship, the bond they develop through the story, that makes you root for them. Their relationship added so much to the overall story, and I found myself interested in each of them both individually and as partners against the house's dark forces. The Hacienda is a beautifully well-written, suspenseful, and haunting story. It's Gothic, but with its own flavor and charm, and Kanyas has created something truly engaging here, as this is her debut novel. I gave this 4 stars. If you're looking for a story with a mix of Gothic horror, compelling characters, and just a touch of romance, I'd highly recommend this one. Alright, next up on my list is The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. I recently released a video about my attempt to find a book for fans of the movie Scream, and in the end, this was the book I decided to read for it. That video is linked below and is the first episode of a new series I'm calling Silver Screams to Broken Spines, where I look for books that match the vibe of some of my favorite horror movies. In this video, I go pretty deep into the book, so I won't say a lot in this wrap-up, but I encourage you to watch that video if you want to know more about my opinions on this book. In the Final Girl Support Group, popular slasher films are inspired by real-life traumatic events and real survivors. These final girls are older now, still scared and burdened by what they went through. They are all in group therapy together, still dealing with their trauma. But the twist here is that a new threat arises, putting them back in danger. This book combines dark humor with some sharp meta-commentary, and Hendrix's love for horror, especially slasher films, really shines through. The writing is fast-paced and funny, with enough twists to keep you guessing the whole way. And if you're a horror fan, the book is packed with clever nods to classic horror movies that make it especially fun to read. This is the first Grady Hendrix book I've ever read, and if his other books are similar quality to this, I think I am a fan. The book was a lot of fun to read, but on a deeper level, I really appreciated how Hendrix tackled the trauma these women live with. The book plays with the idea that in today's culture, with the popularity of true crime content, killers are sometimes celebrated more than the victims. It taps into the way real-life violence can become entertainment, sometimes overshadowing the survivors' stories. It's a thought-provoking angle that adds a lot of depth to this fun horror thriller. Overall, I'd say The Final Girl Support Group is a must-read for fans of classic slasher films. I gave this book 4 stars. Hendrix's mix of dark humor, horror know-how, and thoughtful commentary on trauma made this a great read for me. Next up is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. There's a lot of hype surrounding this novel, so I was somewhat expecting to be disappointed, but this book completely took me by surprise, and I'm really excited to dive into it with you. Mexican Gothic follows Noemi Taboada, a socialite in 1950s Mexico City who is sent by her father to a remote estate called the High Place because her cousin Catalina has fallen mysteriously ill there, and Noemi's task is to find out what is really going on. Soon enough, though, she realizes that there's something very dark and twisted happening at the High Place, and she's in way deeper than she expected. This book really took its time to get going. Most of it was a slow burn, taking on this incredibly atmospheric, almost suffocating sense of dread that slowly creeps in. It was a little hard to get into this at first because of the pacing, but let me tell you, the payoff is so worth it. By the time I was fully absorbed, I was totally in love with the dark Gothic atmosphere and tone. Similar to the Hacienda, the setting here is beautifully detailed. You can feel High Place, the musty walls, the creepy hallways, all of it. It really creates a sense of place that lingers with you, almost like you have actually been there by the time you finish. The vibe is just so cinematic. Noemi is a fantastic protagonist. She's confident, intelligent, and powerful in her own way. Despite the limitations of her patriarchal society, I enjoyed watching her navigate the nightmares going down in the estate and confront these dark forces, and she's such a magnetic character that I could not help but root for her. The book also addresses themes of colonialism and patriarchy. Those themes are woven deeply into the story, touching on how they've impacted indigenous people and women, but how these themes manifest is difficult to really discuss without spoiling the plot, but they add a deeper and incredibly messed up layer to the horror that's happening in the High Place. The story utilizes dream sequences, which were effective for me, adding a layer of mystery and suspense to what's real and what's imagined. And the horror that comes near the end of this book, honestly, I got chills multiple times. The tone shifts in the climax, moving away a bit from the Gothic feel, but it's done in a way that feels totally seamless. The ending was just fantastic, satisfying in a way that ties everything together beautifully. Mexican Gothic takes the classic haunted house and adds a fresh twist. It honors traditional Gothic tropes while weaving in something new and modern. Overall, this was an incredibly unique and suspenseful mystery with some seriously eerie moments. I'm giving Mexican Gothic 4.5 stars. So if you haven't read this one yet and you're in the mood for something dark and suspenseful, definitely check this one out. I think it definitely lives up to the hype. And finally, my favorite book of the month, which is Rest Stop by Nat Cassidy. Nat Cassidy is a new and promising author in the horror genre. I read my first novel of his earlier this year, a book called Nestlings. I enjoyed Nestlings. It was incredibly written, especially how he wrote horror. But I felt somewhat underwhelmed by this, but mainly as a comparison to the incredible praise it was receiving on BookTube. The praise set the expectation too high for me, but I still thought it was a great novel from a promising new author. And all that considered, I will disclose that the high praise I'm about to give this book, Rest Stop, is just my opinion. I don't think this book is going to change anyone's life. Maybe this could be a novel that can help someone fall in love with reading or reading horror, given how much is packed in such a short page turner. But even then, I don't think this is for every horror fan. But this definitely was for me. This is about a young musician who finds himself locked inside a gas station bathroom in the middle of the night. I'm not going to tell you much about the plot beyond that because part of what I loved about this was watching how everything unraveled. On Goodreads, the author Nat Cassidy compares the book to Green Room meets Gerald's Game, which is a comparison I can definitely support. I won't discuss Green Room's comparison too much because I need to reel some plot points in Rest Stop, but Green Room was a pretty good A24 film. In both Green Room and Rest Stop, you can expect a lot of bloody violence. In fact, Nat Cassidy says this is the closest to extreme horror he's ever written, which is a genre I haven't really dug into or really had much interest in. But I think the Gerald's Game comparison is quite accurate, and maybe explains why I love this book so much. I'm kind of weird, and I consider Gerald's Game as one of my favorite Stephen King novels due to the skill in which he can write people in excruciating psychological and physical stress. And with Rest Stop, I think Nat Cassidy is successful in capturing this magic. This was such a stressful book to read. Similar to Gerald's Game, we see the extents of psychological and physical torture our main character endures in the desperate pursuit of survival. It gave an incredibly claustrophobic feel, but managed to also be kind of funny. Things go from bad to worse throughout the novel, and despite how fast-paced this novel is, there is a lot of introspection and depth given to our main character that makes this so much more than just a gore fest. To me, this is a perfect horror novel, and Nat Cassidy is a sick man for writing it. This is a 5-star book. You should check it out. And that wraps up everything I read in October. Thanks so much for hanging out with me in my haunted library. Until next time, feel free to drop a comment below and let me know what books you've been loving lately. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Happy reading.